There are two swans on the lake. They look almost identical. Same white plumage, same orange bill, same silhouette on the water. A person walking past on the path would not give either of them a second look, would not register any difference between them, would probably not even notice that there were two rather than one. But one of those birds is 3 years old, and one of them is 19. And if you knew what to look for, you would never mistake one for the other again. The differences between a young mute swan and an old one are not primarily physical. They are behavioral. They are strategic. They are the accumulated product of 2 decades of specific experience in a specific environment, refined through trial and error and loss and competition into something that operates at a level of efficiency that the 3-year-old bird is not yet capable of and has no shortcut to acquiring. What old swans do differently is not a small thing. It is the difference between a bird running on instinct and a bird running on knowledge, between an animal responding to its environment and an animal that has learned to read its environment in ways that take years to develop and that cannot be inherited, cannot be taught directly, and cannot be rushed. What follows is what that difference actually looks like, not in abstract terms, in specific, observable, documented behavior. The things that change in a swan across 20 years on the same water. The things that young swans get wrong, consistently and predictably, that old swans stopped getting wrong years ago. And at the end, something about what old swans know that young swans do not. That has implications not just for understanding the bird, but for understanding what experience actually is, what it does to an animal, what it makes possible that nothing else can. Number 1. How old swans read water, and why young swans are guessing. A mute swan feeds primarily by upending, extending the neck to its full length to crop aquatic vegetation from the bottom. The feeding is not random, it is spatially specific. The birds return repeatedly to the same feeding locations within their territory, the spots where the vegetation is densest, most accessible, and most nutritionally valuable. A young swan learning a new territory is working from a map with almost nothing on it. It finds vegetation through exploration, through trial and error, through the slow accumulation of successes and failures that eventually builds a picture of where the food is and when it is accessible. This process takes time. A first-year bird on its first independent territory is expending significantly more energy per unit of nutrition acquired than an established adult on the same territory, because the established adult is not exploring. It is executing. It goes where the food is because it knows where the food is. The knowledge was built over years of visits to every corner of the water, across every season, through every variation in water level and temperature and plant growth that the territory has produced. But the difference goes further than the location of food. Old swans read the water itself. They know how the bottom changes across the territory, where the soft sediment is and where the substrate is hard, where the depth is right for their reach and where it exceeds it, where the current runs, if there is one, and how it affects the distribution of floating vegetation, where the warm shallows heat earliest in spring, bringing the first new plant growth, and where the cold, deep water keeps vegetation dormant longest. Researchers fitting GPS loggers and depth sensors to swans of known ages at long-term study sites have found that older birds show significantly more efficient foraging paths than younger birds, not just within a session, but across seasons. The older bird's route through the territory in March reflects knowledge of what March produces on that specific water, knowledge that was not available at the start and that accumulated one March at a time across the years. A young swan on the same territory is looking at a lake. An old swan on the same territory is reading a document it has been writing for 20 years. Number 2. How old swans handle conflict. and what young swans still have not figured out. Territorial conflict in mute swans is energetically expensive, physically dangerous, and occasionally fatal. A bird that misjudges the intensity or capability of a rival and commits to a full physical confrontation against a better opponent can sustain injuries that affect its survival prospects for months. The stakes of getting conflict wrong are high. The behavioral difference between old and young birds in how they manage conflict is, accordingly, one of the most significant differences between them. Young male swans in their first and second years of territory holding are, as a general pattern, consistently overreactive. They escalate too fast. They commit to confrontations that a more experienced bird would have resolved at the display stage or deflected entirely. They fail to read the specific signals that indicate whether an approaching bird is a genuine territorial challenge or a transiting non-breeder that poses no real threat to the territory. They spend energy on conflicts that did not need to happen. They acquire injuries from confrontations that a more precise assessment of the situation would have avoided. The error is understandable. A young bird with its first territory and its first mate is running a behavioral system that is calibrated for the importance of what it is protecting, not for the specific threat level of what it is facing. Everything feels like a potential challenge, because the territory and the pair bond are new enough that the cost of losing them is not yet something the bird has learned to calculate against the cost of defending against a non-threat. Old swans make almost none of these errors. A territorial male in his second decade has seen enough intruders that he has an extensive database of what a real challenge looks like versus what a transiting bird looks like versus what an exploratory juvenile looks like. He knows the difference because he has seen each category hundreds of times. The discriminations that cost a young bird energy and attention to make are automatic for him. He responds proportionally. He invests in conflict at the level the conflict actually warrants, not at the level his anxiety about his territory suggests. The result is visible in time budget analyses of old versus young territorial males. Old birds spend less time in territorial display, less time in active confrontation, and less time in post-conflict vigilance. Not because they face fewer challenges, because they resolve the challenges they do face more efficiently, and because their accurate threat assessment means they do not generate false conflicts in the first place. The lake that an old swan holds looks calmer than a lake held by a young swan. Not because less is happening, because the bird managing it has gotten better at making it look like nothing is happening while maintaining complete control of the situation. Number 3. What old swans know about predators. The knowledge that young swans buy with their cygnets. Cygnet mortality in mute swans is highest in first and second-time breeders. This is one of the most consistent findings across long-term swan population studies. The birds that lose the most cygnets are the youngest parents. The birds that produce the most surviving young per breeding attempt are the birds with the most breeding experience. The gap between the two is not marginal. It is substantial. Part of the explanation is simple skill development. Incubation, brooding, and active defense of young are behaviors that improve with practice. A first-time breeding female makes incubation errors that an experienced female does not make. She leaves the nest for longer periods during bad weather. She selects a nest site with less attention to water level risk. She responds to disturbance during incubation in ways that compromise egg temperature. All of these errors are correctable, and they do get corrected over successive breeding seasons, but the predator knowledge dimension is deeper than skill, and it is the part that takes longest to acquire. An old swan in a territory it has held for many years knows the specific predator pressure of that specific place. It knows which part of the bank the fox uses. It knows the approach pattern of the heron that takes cygnets. It knows which time of day the large gulls are most active and most aggressive toward small cygnets. It knows this because it has experienced it, season after season, and has adjusted its behavior around it. A young swan on a new territory does not know any of this. The predator pressure of a specific place is information that exists nowhere except in the experience of the animals that have lived there. It cannot be read from the landscape. It has to be learned through encounter. And the currency of that learning, in the early breeding years, is often cygnets. Researchers tracking cygnet survival rates against parental age at multiple study sites have found a learning curve that is consistent and steep in the early years, and that flattens significantly by the 5th or 6th breeding season. A bird breeding for the 5th time is operating with enough accumulated predator knowledge about its specific territory that its cygnet survival rate approaches that of the most experienced birds. The first 3 breeding attempts, for most pairs, are bought at a cost. Old swans are not better parents in any abstract sense. They are better parents in this specific place, because they know what this specific place requires. That knowledge does not transfer. If an old swan with 15 years of experience on one lake is displaced to a new territory, its cygnet survival rate in the first breeding season on the new water will look more like a young bird's than an old bird's. The knowledge is territorial. It is local. It is earned in the specific place where it applies. Number 4. How old swans manage their pair bond differently. A mute swan pair is not a static thing. It is a relationship that changes over time, that develops its own specific dynamics, its own communication shortcuts, its own division of labor, across the years of shared experience. Young pairs, even pairs that have formed strong bonds, are still figuring each other out. They are learning each other's behavioral tendencies. They are negotiating through the trial and error of actual breeding seasons and territorial conflicts and encounters with neighbors, who does what and when. The coordination that looks effortless in an old pair is not effortless. It was built. It required years of calibration that happens one season at a time. Old pairs show a quality of behavioral coordination that researchers describe carefully as something beyond simple familiarity. The timing of their responses to disturbance, the division of vigilance during vulnerable periods, the communication during territorial challenges, which in old pairs operates through signals so subtle and so specific to the pair's shared history that observers who have not watched that specific pair for extended periods often cannot identify what information is being exchanged. The male turns before the female has made an observable signal. The female adjusts her position on the nest in response to something the male did at the territory boundary that involved no obvious alarming behavior. What old pairs have built is a joint behavioral system, a distributed intelligence, if that phrase can be used carefully, that operates across 2 birds with decades of shared history. Neither bird is running the system alone. Both birds are running it together with a precision that requires exactly the history they have. Young pairs imitate this. They produce coordination. They respond to each other. But the depth of calibration is not there yet. It takes years to build, and it is built in no other way. There is something in this worth sitting with quietly. The old pair on the lake has been doing this together for longer than most human relationships last. They have raised cygnets that are themselves now adults, with their own territories. They have held this water through droughts and floods and hard winters. They have made every kind of mistake together that a pair can make and learned from all of them. The behavioral system they are running now is not the system they started with. It is what that system became after 20 years of refinement against everything the world threw at it. Number 5. What old swans do in winter, and why it matters more than anyone watching would guess. Winter is when the gap between old and young swans is widest, and it is the season that most visitors to Swan lakes pay the least attention to. An old swan entering winter on an established territory has spent the autumn building fat reserves through a feeding campaign that is itself a product of accumulated experience. It knows which feeding locations produce the most nutrition per unit of effort in October and November. It knows how the territory's food resources shift as temperature drops and aquatic vegetation dies back. It knows, in the specific way that behavioral knowledge always comes down to specific rather than general, how to maintain its body condition through the cold months on this particular water. Young swans entering their first or second winter do not have this knowledge. They are managing their energy budget through a season whose demands they have not yet fully experienced, on a water whose winter resources they do not yet fully know, without the calibrated behavioral strategy that transforms winter from a threat into something navigable. The mortality data is consistent. First and second winter birds show significantly higher overwinter mortality than birds with several winters behind them. The gap closes as experience accumulates. An established adult on familiar territory in a normal winter is not at serious risk. Its energy management is too precise, its knowledge of its resources too detailed for the normal variation of a temperate winter to threaten it. What the old swan is doing in January, sitting apparently motionless on familiar water in cold gray light, is not enduring. It is executing a winter strategy, refined across 15 or 20 iterations of the same season. It knows when to move and when to stay still. It knows what the weather signals that preceded the last hard freeze looked like because it was there for the last hard freeze and the one before that. It knows how long the open water in the southwest corner of the territory stays liquid after the rest of the lake has frozen, because it discovered that corner's properties in its third or fourth winter and has been returning to it every winter since. The young bird on the same lake is learning. The old bird is operating. The gap between those two states is not talent. It is not genetics. It is not the product of anything that can be transferred or inherited or accelerated. It is time, specific time, in a specific place, with specific outcomes, added up season by season into something that functions with an efficiency and a precision that makes the animal running it look, from the outside, like it is doing almost nothing. The apparent stillness of an old swan on winter water is the most misleading thing about it. Everything that stillness represents took 20 years to earn. Tell me in the comments, is there a swan at a lake near you that you have been watching long enough to sense the difference? A bird that moves differently, responds differently, carries itself differently from the younger birds around it? Tell me what you have noticed. I read every one.